In the year 740 BC, a man entered the Temple of Jerusalem and saw something no human being was ever meant to see. The ground shook. Smoke filled the entire hall. And in the center of the highest throne that has ever existed, a figure so immense that just the hem of his robes covered the entire floor of the temple. Around him were creatures of fire with 6 wings each, 2 covering their faces, because not even they could look directly at that being, 2 covering their feet, and 2 for flying. And these creatures cried out to one another with a voice so powerful that the temple columns vibrated with every word. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The man fell to his knees, not out of worship, but out of panic, because he knew that any human who saw that should die. And the first words that came out of his mouth were not a prayer, they were a cry of despair. I am lost. This man's name was Isaiah. And what happened that day inside the temple did not just transform his life, it transformed the history of an entire nation. Isaiah was not a peasant, he was not a shepherd taken from the fields like Amos. He was a member of Jerusalem's elite, possibly from the royal family itself. And for the next 60 years, he would advise kings, challenge empires, walk naked through the city streets as a prophetic sign, and predict events with a precision that still leaves historians without answers today. But before you can understand who Isaiah was, you need to understand where he lived. Because Jerusalem in the 8th century BC was not the city you imagine. It was something completely different. Close your eyes for a second and forget everything you have ever seen in a movie. Forget the Hollywood version of Jerusalem. Forget the postcard images. Isaiah's Jerusalem was a city that could fit entirely inside a medium-sized neighborhood of any major modern city. We are talking about something around 60 hectares. For comparison, Central Park in New York is about 341 hectares. All of Jerusalem would fit into less than a fifth of that park. And within that tight space lived between 15,000 and 25,000 people. The streets were narrow, crooked, and mostly unpaved. Think of alleys 6 to 9 feet wide, where 2 loaded donkeys could barely pass each other. The ground was packed earth mixed with gravel, and after a heavy rain, it turned into mud. The smell that greeted you as you entered the gates was a mixture of animal manure, smoke from bread ovens, wet sheep's wool, and depending on the wind direction, the sweet, heavy aroma of incense burning in the temple high up on the mount. But do not be fooled by its size. This tiny city was the spiritual center of an entire civilization. And at the top of everything, literally at the highest point, stood the Temple of Solomon. Built nearly 200 years before Isaiah was born, the temple still dominated the entire landscape. The white limestone blocks reflected the sunlight in a way that made the building appear to glow. Ancient historians said that looking directly at the temple at noon was like looking at snow. It hurt the eyes. And it was there, in that temple, that the religious life of the entire nation pulsed. Priests in white tunics climbed up and down the staircases carrying lambs for sacrifice. The sound of chanting mixed with the bleating of animals. And every morning and every evening, the smell of burning meat on the bronze altar rose like a column of smoke, visible for miles. Isaiah knew every stone of that place, and not as a visitor, as someone who belonged to that world. The biblical text introduces him as the son of Amos, and here is a detail that almost no one notices. According to Jewish tradition recorded in the Talmud, Amos, Isaiah's father, was the brother of King Amaziah of Judah. If this is true, and many scholars consider it plausible, Isaiah was a first cousin to King Uzziah, the king's cousin. This changes absolutely everything about how you need to understand this prophet. Isaiah was not a man shouting from outside the palace walls. He was inside. He had direct access to the throne. When he confronted a king, it was not as a stranger invading the court. It was as a family member looking another family member in the eye and saying, "You are destroying everything." And you can see this in the way he wrote. If you take the book of Isaiah and compare it to the book of Amos, who was a simple shepherd from Tekoa, the difference is striking. Isaiah writes with a vocabulary that linguists consider the most sophisticated in the entire Old Testament. He uses complex metaphors, Hebrew wordplays that only work if you master the language at the highest level, and political references that require knowledge of international diplomacy. This man had an elite education. He knew how to read and write in a time when less than 5% of the population was literate. Imagine this. Isaiah likely grew up in one of the larger houses in Jerusalem, in the western quarter of the city, where archaeologists have found residences with 4 to 6 rooms, carved stone floors, and even rudimentary drainage systems. He would have learned to read the Torah scrolls since childhood. He would have attended the temple not as an occasional pilgrim, but as part of the daily routine of the religious aristocracy. He knew the priests by name. He knew how every ritual worked. He understood the power games between the palace and the temple. And it is exactly this privileged position that makes Isaiah's calling so devastating. Because when God appeared to him that day in the temple, he did not appear to an ignorant man who did not understand the system. He appeared to someone who knew the system from the inside, and who knew exactly how rotten it was. But to understand the moment of the vision, you need to understand what had just happened in Jerusalem, and what had happened was a disaster. King Uzziah was dead. Uzziah, also called Azariah, had reigned for 52 years, 52. To put that into perspective, that is longer than almost any modern president, dictator, or prime minister you can think of. Entire generations of people in Jerusalem were born, grew up, married, had children, and died without ever having known another king. Uzziah was Judah, and he was not just any king. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 describes a reign that transformed Judah from an irrelevant kingdom into a regional power. Uzziah reorganized the army, 3,700 trained soldiers under the command of 2,600 heads of warrior families. He equipped every soldier with shields, spears, helmets, coats of mail, bows, and even slings. He built towers in Jerusalem, at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and at the angle of the wall, and fortified them. He dug cisterns in the desert because he had large herds in both the lowlands and the plains. He planted vineyards and fields in the mountains and in Carmel, for he loved the soil, the biblical text says. And an impressive detail, he developed war machines designed by engineers to be placed on the towers and the corners of the walls, capable of shooting arrows and large stones. If this surprised you, comment, "I didn't know," because most people have never heard that a king of Judah in the 8th century BC already had military engineers designing siege engines. Uzziah's fame spread as far as Egypt. The text says that his name spread far and wide, for he was marvelously helped until he became strong. And that is where the twist that destroyed everything comes in, because the Bible has a pattern that repeats with terrifying precision. When a man becomes too powerful and begins to confuse his success with his identity, the fall is inevitable. Uzziah entered the temple, and not to worship, to burn incense on the altar. This was the exclusive work of the priests, descendants of Aaron, specifically consecrated for this function. The king did not have that right, and 80 priests went in after him and said, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful." And what did Uzziah do? He became furious. He was standing there, censer in hand, face red with rage, shouting at the priests. And at that exact moment, while he was still shouting, leprosy broke out on his forehead. There, in front of everyone. The text of 2 Chronicles is surgical. Then Azariah the chief priest looked at him, and behold, he was leprous on his forehead. They hurried him out of there, and he himself hurried to get out because the Lord had struck him. Uzziah spent the rest of his life isolated in a separate house, cut off from all human contact, cut off from the temple, cut off from the throne. His son Jotham took over the government in his place, and when Uzziah finally died in 740 BC, they did not bury him in the tomb of the kings. They buried him in a field adjacent to the royal cemetery, for they said, "He is a leper, a 52-year reign, a nation transformed." And in the end, a man dying alone in an empty house with his skin falling apart, without even the right to a dignified grave. And it is exactly at this moment, with the nation in mourning, the throne still warm, and uncertainty dominating every conversation on every corner of Jerusalem, that Isaiah enters the temple. The text of Isaiah chapter 6 begins with a phrase that seems simple, but carries enormous weight. "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up." Do you see the contrast? The earthly king has just died, disgraced, leprous, alone. And Isaiah sees the true king. Uzziah tried to enter the temple to act as a priest and was destroyed. Isaiah enters the temple as a worshipper and sees God himself. The throne that Isaiah sees has no earthly comparison. The Lord is seated so high that the hem of his robes, just the hem, filled the entire temple. Imagine the scale of this. Solomon's temple had a holy of holies that was 30 feet high, and just the bottom edge of God's garment already occupied all that space. The being sitting on that throne was of a magnitude that the human mind simply collapses trying to process. And then the seraphim. The Hebrew word seraphim comes from the root meaning to burn. Fiery creatures, each with 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And here is something that gives you chills. They covered their faces. These creatures, celestial beings of pure fire, more powerful than anything that exists in the physical world, could not look directly at God. If they needed to protect themselves, what was Isaiah doing there, a human of flesh and blood, with his eyes wide open? The cry of the seraphim, "Holy, holy, holy," shook the foundations of the temple. The doorposts trembled, and smoke filled the entire hall, that dense smoke of incense that burns the eyes and fills the lungs, making the air almost unbreathable. Isaiah was simultaneously before the most glorious and the most terrifying thing a human being can experience, and his reaction was not ecstasy, it was absolute terror. "Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Pay attention to the structure of this confession. He does not say, "I have sinned," in a generic way. He speaks specifically of lips, unclean lips. For a man who is about to be called to be the mouth of God for an entire nation, this confession is surgical. Isaiah instinctively recognized that the part of him that would be used the most was exactly the part that was most contaminated. He could not speak for God when his own mouth was dirty. And it is here that one of the most visceral moments in the entire Bible happens. One of the seraphim flew to the altar, took a live coal with tongs, a glowing stone, shining red and orange, and flew to Isaiah. And he touched his mouth with the coal. Imagine the scene, a creature of fire coming toward you with a burning coal in its hand, and pressing it against your lips. The text does not say it was painless. It does not say it was symbolic. The coal touched the flesh, and the seraphim said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Isaiah's purification did not come through a beautiful ritual, a poetic prayer, or a ceremonial bath. It came through fire. It came through pain. And if you understand this principle, you understand the entire theology of the book of Isaiah. Genuine purification is never comfortable. And then, the voice. Not the voice of the seraphim, not the voice of an angel, the voice of God himself, filling the entire space. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah, the man who seconds before was certain he was going to die, with his lips still burning, answered with words that changed the destiny of a nation. "Here am I, send me."
O Lord.
If you believe that God still calls imperfect people for impossible missions, comment, "He still calls." But here is the detail that almost no one mentions when telling the story. What God said after Isaiah's yes was not encouraging, it was devastating. God did not say, "Go and they will listen to you." He said the opposite. "Go and say to this people, keep on hearing but do not understand, keep on seeing but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed." Isaiah was called to preach to a people who would not listen. He was given a mission that, from a human perspective, was a guaranteed failure before it even began. And when he asked, "How long, O Lord?" the answer was even darker. "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste." This is Isaiah's calling, not a mission of success, a mission of faithfulness in a context of total rejection. And it is with this weight on his shoulders that he left the temple that day and stepped back into the narrow streets of Jerusalem to begin the most thankless work in the prophetic history of Israel. And what kind of Jerusalem was waiting for Isaiah outside the temple? Because the city he knew was about to go through the most turbulent decades of its history. 4 kings, 2 invasions, a civil war of faith, and in the center of it all, a prophet who walked between palaces and alleys with the same authority, speaking truths that no one wanted to hear. To understand what Isaiah faced, you need to understand the political map of that moment. And what was happening on that map was terrifying, because to the east, growing like a shadow, swallowing entire nations, was the greatest military empire the world had seen up to that point, Assyria. What Assyria meant for Jerusalem, and how Isaiah placed himself between cowardly kings and bloodthirsty generals, that is something that will require you to understand the level of brutality that was marching toward that tiny city, Assyria. Just the name made kings lose sleep. And not out of exaggeration, out of experience. Because what the Assyrians did to conquered nations was not simply defeating them, it was dismantling them, erasing them, turning entire peoples into ghosts of history. The Assyrian Empire in Isaiah's time was ruled by a lineage of kings who treated war as a science and cruelty as state policy. And for you to understand what was marching toward Jerusalem, you need to know the details that the Assyrians made sure to record, not hide, record, on their own stone monuments. In the reliefs of the Palace of Nineveh, which archaeologists unearthed in the 19th century, the Assyrians proudly carved scenes of what they did to conquered cities. Prisoners impaled on stakes in front of the walls, rows of severed heads piled in perfect pyramids next to the gates. Men being flayed alive while scribes nearby counted the bodies and recorded the numbers on clay tablets. It was not uncontrolled barbarity, it was organized barbarity, bureaucratic, with reports. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ascended the Assyrian throne in 745 BC, 5 years before Isaiah's vision in the temple, perfected a strategy that changed the geopolitics of the ancient world. He was not satisfied with defeating a people and collecting tribute. He deported entire populations. He tore thousands of families from their lands, separated husbands from wives, fathers from children, and redistributed these broken groups into opposite corners of the empire. The logic was simple and diabolical. A people without land, without a common language, without family structure, does not revolt. They die in silence. And this empire was looking at the corridor of the land of Israel with the same hunger a wolf looks at a flock trapped in a pen. The problem is that between Assyria and Egypt, the 2 great powers of the time, there was a narrow strip of land where the small kingdoms of the Levant were located. Israel to the north, Judah to the south, and between and around them Damascus, Moab, Edom, Philistia. All these tiny kingdoms lived squeezed between two giants, trying to survive by playing one against the other. And when the Assyrian pressure increased, these small kingdoms began to panic. And panic, as Isaiah would discover, makes kings make the worst decisions possible. In 735 BC, something happened that threw Jerusalem into the center of a crisis that almost destroyed everything. Rezin, king of Damascus, and Pekah, king of Israel, the northern kingdom with its capital in Samaria, formed a military alliance against Assyria. The idea was to bring all the small kingdoms of the region together into a coalition large enough to resist the Assyrian advance. And they wanted Judah to join this alliance. The problem is that Judah said no. Jotham, son of Uzziah, had died, and on the throne of Jerusalem now was Ahaz, Uzziah's grandson, a 20-year-old man whom the Bible describes as one of the worst kings in the history of Judah. Ahaz refused to enter the coalition, and Rezin and Pekah responded the only way cornered kings respond, with war. They marched against Jerusalem with an explicit plan to overthrow Ahaz, place a puppet called the son of Tabeel on the throne of Judah, and force the new government to join the alliance. The text of Isaiah chapter 7 describes the moment the news reached the palace. The heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. They didn't just tremble, they shaked. The image is of branches swaying uncontrollably in a storm. The young king was in absolute panic. Two armies marching against him, his capital besieged, his throne threatened, and he didn't have the slightest idea what to do. And it is at this exact moment that God sends Isaiah to speak to the king. The instruction is specific. Go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. Think about this scene. The king is inspecting Jerusalem's water system because when a siege approaches, the first thing you protect is the water supply. Ahaz is there, probably with engineers and military officials, calculating how long the city can hold out. And Isaiah appears with his small son in hand. By the way, the son's name, Shear-Jashub. In Hebrew, it means a remnant shall return. Isaiah did not just preach prophetic messages, he named his children as living messages. Every time someone called that boy by name, they were repeating a prophecy. Every time the boy introduced himself to play with other children in the streets of Jerusalem, the prophecy walked among the people. Isaiah turned his own family into a sign, and the message he brought to Ahaz that day, there by the water conduit, was surprising. Be careful, be quiet. Do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stubs of firebrands. Smoldering stubs of firebrands. Isaiah looked at two kings who had armies marching against Jerusalem and called them almost extinguished ends of wood. Rezin and Pekah, in the prophetic vision, were not real threats. They were fire that was already dying. Their coalition would fail. Damascus would fall. Israel would fall. All Ahaz needed to do was one thing: trust. And then Isaiah did something extraordinary. He said to Ahaz, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven." God, through Isaiah, was offering the king of Judah a blank check. Any sign, from the bottom of the abyss to the top of the sky. No limits, just to confirm that the prophetic word was true. And Ahaz's response? "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." It sounds like humility. It sounds like reverence, but Isaiah saw through the mask instantly. Ahaz did not refuse the sign because he was too pious to ask. He refused because he had already made his decision. He had already decided what he was going to do, and it did not involve trusting God. Ahaz had already sent messengers to Assyria. He was about to do exactly the opposite of what Isaiah commanded. Instead of trusting the prophetic word, he was going to throw himself into the arms of the same monster that threatened to swallow the entire region. Isaiah's response to this refusal is one of the sharpest sentences a prophet ever directed at a king. Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? And then came the prophecy that would traverse the centuries. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God with us. A sign that Ahaz did not ask for, given by a God whom Ahaz was rejecting, with a meaning that Ahaz did not want to hear, because the name Emmanuel was not just a promise of divine presence, it was a warning. God is here, Ahaz. He sees what you are doing. He sees whom you are trusting. And what did Ahaz do? Exactly what Isaiah feared. 2 Kings chapter 16 records that Ahaz took the silver and gold that were in the temple of Jerusalem and in the treasures of the royal palace, and sent them as a gift to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, with a message that hurts to read. I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me. I am your servant and your son, the king of Judah, heir to the throne of David, descendant of the lineage through which God promised to bless the world, voluntarily bowing before a pagan emperor and declaring himself his slave, and not just with words, with the gold of the temple. The gold that Solomon had dedicated to God now paid tribute to a king who titled himself the Great King, the King of the universe, the King of the four corners of the earth. And Assyria answered. Tiglath-Pileser marched against Damascus and destroyed it. Rezin was killed. The kingdom of Israel began to be dismantled piece by piece. The anti-Assyrian coalition collapsed exactly as Isaiah had predicted. But victory had a price that Ahaz did not calculate, or did not want to calculate, because now Judah was no longer an independent kingdom. It was a vassal. And when you invite the wolf into the pen to protect the sheep from a fox, the wolf does not leave afterward. Ahaz traveled to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, the visit of a servant paying homage to his lord. And there he saw a pagan altar that impressed him. He had a detailed drawing made with all the measurements and sent it to Urijah the priest in Jerusalem with an order, build an exact replica. And when Ahaz returned, the altar was ready. And he did something unthinkable. He moved the original bronze altar, the one that had stood before the house of the Lord since Solomon's time, and placed the pagan altar in the central position. Imagine what Isaiah felt seeing this. The temple where he had the vision that changed his life, where the seraphim sang, Holy, 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 where the coal purified his lips, now had a pagan altar as its centerpiece of worship, and the man responsible for this abomination was the king. The man Isaiah had gone to advise personally, the man who had chosen Assyria over God. But Ahaz did not stop at the altar. The second book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles record that he closed the doors of the temple. He cut the sacred vessels to pieces. He built pagan altars on every corner of Jerusalem. And, the darkest detail of all, he burned his own sons in sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, following the practices of the Canaanite peoples that Israel had been called to replace. The valley of Hinnom, a narrow, rocky valley with steep cliffs on both sides, where the worshippers of Molech lit massive fires inside bronze structures and placed live children on the glowing metal. The smell of burning flesh that rose from that valley was different from the smell of the temple altar, and all of Jerusalem knew the difference. The screams that echoed between those stone walls were not songs of praise, and this valley, precisely because of these horrors, ended up lending its Hebrew name Gehinnom to a word you know very well, Gehenna, the term that centuries later would be used to describe hell. Isaiah lived through all of this. He walked those streets, he breathed that smoke, he heard those screams, and he kept prophesying, he kept speaking, He kept appearing at the court, at the city gates, in the places where the people gathered, saying the words no one wanted to hear. Chapter after chapter of his book during this period is a catalogue of denunciations against a nation that was devouring itself from within. Woe to those who join house to house and add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. This is Isaiah chapter 5. He was denouncing land concentration, rich aristocrats buying property after property, evicting peasant families who had cultivated those lands for generations. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening as wine inflames them. Jerusalem's elite lived in endless banquets while the people went hungry. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Moral inversion. When a society reaches the point where calling wrong right becomes normal, Isaiah says that judgment is not just coming, it has already arrived. The rot is already installed, and most disturbing, the people did not notice. Or they noticed and did not care. And while Judah rotted from within, to the north, the final catastrophe was unfolding in real time. In 722 BC, less than 20 years after Isaiah's vision in the temple, the Assyrian army, now under the command of Shalmaneser V and then Sargon II, besieged Samaria, the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. The siege lasted 3 years, 3 years of hunger, of disease, of growing despair within those walls. And when the city finally fell, what happened next was exactly what Isaiah had predicted. Sargon II recorded in the annals of his palace at Khorsabad, I besieged and conquered Samaria. I deported 27,290 inhabitants. 27,000 people torn from their homes, thrown into deportation caravans that marched on foot for hundreds of miles to Mesopotamia, to Media, to territories so distant that those families would never return. And in their place, the Assyrians brought colonists from other regions of the empire, from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and planted them in the land of Israel. The northern kingdom simply ceased to exist. 10 tribes, centuries of history, kings, prophets, sanctuaries, traditions, families dating back to the sons of Jacob, all swept away. The so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel were not lost by accident. They were lost by imperial engineering. Assyria did not just conquer Israel, it erased Israel. And Jerusalem watched all of this happen less than 40 miles away. The refugees who managed to flee before the final siege brought the stories. The roads entering Jerusalem from the north carried entire families with hollow eyes, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, telling of Assyrian soldiers burning villages, cutting down trees, poisoning wells. The population of Jerusalem, which had already been growing during Uzziah's reign, swelled with the arrival of these refugees. Archaeologists estimate that the city may have tripled in size during this period, expanding west from the original mount, creating new neighborhoods that were rushed and poorly planned. And on every refugee's face that entered through the gates, the same silent question, are we next? Isaiah knew the answer. And the answer was not simple, because what was coming for Jerusalem was not just an army, it was a test that would depend entirely on who was sitting on the throne when the moment arrived. And Ahaz, the king who burned his sons in the valley of Hinnom and placed a pagan altar in God's temple, was about to die. In 715 BC, Ahaz finally died, and just like Uzziah, Jerusalem did not give him honor in death. The second book of Chronicles records that they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel. 2 kings in a row rejected even in burial. But what came after Ahaz was something no one, perhaps not even Isaiah himself, expected. Because Ahaz's son did not follow in his father's footsteps. His name was Hezekiah, and he was about to become the greatest ally Isaiah ever had. And together, prophet and king, they would face the most desperate moment Jerusalem ever lived. A moment when 185,000 Assyrian soldiers camped outside the walls, and the enemy general shouted in Hebrew so that everyone on the wall could hear, "Your God is not going to save you." Hezekiah was 25 years old when he ascended the throne, and the first thing he did, not the second, not when he had time, the first, was to open the doors of the temple that his father had closed. The second book of Chronicles, chapter 29, records that this happened in the first month of the first year of his reign, on the first day. Hezekiah did not wait for the coronation dust to settle. He did not wait to consolidate political alliances. He did not wait to evaluate the geopolitical situation. He opened the doors, and when the priests and Levites entered that space for the first time in years, what they found was devastation, accumulated filth, sacred objects thrown on the floor, Ahaz's pagan altar still occupying the central place. And Hezekiah said to them, "Consecrate yourselves now, and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place." The cleaning took 16 days, 8 days to reach the portico of the temple, and another 8 to purify the interior. 16 days carrying out everything that Ahaz had put inside. And every pagan object removed was taken to the Kidron Valley and destroyed. But Hezekiah did not stop at the temple. He ordered the destruction of the pagan altars that Ahaz had scattered on every corner of Jerusalem. He cut down the Asherah poles. He broke the stone images, and then he did something that shocked even those who supported him. He destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the desert centuries before. That same serpent that, in the book of Numbers, God commanded Moses to lift on a pole to heal the Israelites bitten by snakes, a relic more than 700 years old, and the people were burning incense to it as if it were a god. Hezekiah looked at that piece of bronze loaded with history and said, "It is just a piece of metal," and he broke it in pieces. He gave it a derogatory name, Nehushtan, which means a piece of bronze. The 25-year-old king understood something that older and more experienced kings had not understood. When a tool of deliverance becomes an object of worship, it ceases to serve its purpose and must be destroyed. Now imagine what Isaiah felt seeing all this. For more than 2 decades he had preached against idolatry, against pagan altars, against the corruption of the temple. And 2 kings in a row, Uzziah and Ahaz, had ignored or aggravated every problem he denounced. And now, finally, a king who not only listened, but acted. The relationship between Isaiah and Hezekiah is one of the most extraordinary partnerships in the Bible. They were not friends, at least the text never suggests personal intimacy. They were something more functional and more powerful. They were a prophet who spoke the truth and a king who was willing to hear it. Hezekiah consulted Isaiah. He sent messengers to the prophet in moments of crisis. And Isaiah, who had been ignored by Ahaz with disastrous consequences, now had direct access to the throne. But having an allied king did not mean the problems were over. It meant the problems could be faced head-on. And the biggest problem of all was approaching. Sennacherib, the name that made entire cities surrender before a single soldier appeared on the horizon. Son of Sargon II, the same one who destroyed Samaria and deported the northern kingdom, Sennacherib ascended the Assyrian throne in 705 BC and inherited the largest empire the world had seen up to that point. And in 701 BC, he decided to crush the resistance in the Levant corridor once and for all. Sennacherib himself recorded this campaign on what became known as the Taylor Prism, 6-sided clay prism covered in cuneiform script, now on display at the British Museum. And what he wrote about Judah is one of the most extraordinary documents in biblical archaeology because it confirms the Bible's narrative from the enemy's point of view. Sennacherib lists 46 fortified cities of Judah that he conquered, 46, not villages, not hamlets, cities with walls, one by one falling like dominoes toward Jerusalem. And among these cities, one deserves special attention: Lachish, the second most important city in Judah after Jerusalem. Lachish had double walls, fortified gates, and a palace fortress atop the hill. It was considered impregnable. Sennacherib besieged it with a siege ramp, a massive structure of earth, stones and wood built against the wall so that soldiers could ascend with war machines. This ramp still exists. You can visit it today. It is one of the oldest military structures preserved in the world. And when Lachish fell, Sennacherib was so proud of the conquest that he ordered the entire battle to be carved into the reliefs of his palace in Nineveh. They are massive panels, yards and yards of carved stone, showing every phase of the attack. Assyrian soldiers ascending the ramp with shields, Jewish archers trying desperately to defend the walls, battering rams striking the gates, and after the fall, prisoners marching in endless lines bent under the weight of their belongings, while in the background the city burns. In one detail of the reliefs, 3 men are being impaled on stakes before the destroyed walls. In another, entire families are deported. Women carrying children in their arms, old men leaning on staffs. And in Jerusalem, with every city that fell, with every refugee who arrived with another horror story, the circle closed. It was no longer a distant possibility. It was mathematics. Sennacherib was devouring Judah from the outside in, and the next dish was the capital. Hezekiah knew this, and unlike Ahaz, he did not enter a paralyzing panic. He prepared. The second book of Chronicles, chapter 32, lists what he did. He stopped up all the water springs outside the city so that the Assyrian army would not have access to them. He reinforced the walls. He built a second outer wall at the most vulnerable points. He produced weapons and shields on an industrial scale, and he appointed military commanders over the people. But Hezekiah's most ambitious project, the one that guaranteed Jerusalem's survival, was a feat of engineering that defied everything considered possible at the time. Jerusalem depended on the Gihon Spring, which was outside the city walls in the Kidron Valley. In times of peace, this was not a problem. In times of siege, it was a death sentence. Whoever controlled the spring controlled the water, and whoever controlled the water controlled how long Jerusalem would survive. Hezekiah ordered the excavation of a tunnel through solid rock, 1,950 feet long, to divert the water from the Gihon Spring into the city walls to the pool of Siloam. 2 teams of workers began digging from opposite sides of the hill. No GPS, no precise topographical maps, no modern equipment. Men with bronze and iron picks advancing yard by yard in absolute darkness, guided likely by the sound of tapping and the natural slope of the rock. And at some point, in the heart of that mountain, the 2 teams met. The Siloam inscription, discovered in 1880 inside the tunnel, describes this moment, and on the day of the breakthrough, the hewers struck each toward his companion, pick against pick, and the water flowed from the spring to the reservoir. This tunnel still works. Water still flows through it. More than 2,700 years later, Hezekiah's engineering still delivers water. But all the preparation in the world does not change one basic fact. Jerusalem was a small city, surrounded by hills, with a tiny army compared to the Assyrian military machine. And when Sennacherib finished with the 46 cities of Judah, he turned his eyes to the capital. He did not come personally, at least not initially. He sent 3 high-ranking officials with a massive military detachment, and the most important of them, the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian title for the chief of staff, did something brilliant and cruel. He stopped at exactly the same place where Isaiah had confronted Ahaz decades earlier, at the conduit of the upper pool, on the highway to the washer's field, the same place. Isaiah chapter 36, The text is explicit about the location, and this was not a coincidence. The Assyrians studied their targets. They knew the topography, the history, the strategic points. The Rabshakeh knew exactly where he was standing, and then he opened his mouth. And what came out was not just military intimidation, it was psychological warfare of the highest level. He shouted in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the time, in Hebrew, so that every soldier on walls, every woman in the windows, every child in the streets could understand every word. Hezekiah's officials even asked, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall." And the Rabshakeh responded by raising his voice even higher. "Has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall?" And what he said was a speech so well constructed that it deserves to be analyzed line by line. First, he attacked military confidence. On what do you rest this trust of yours? You say you have counsel and strength for war, but they are only empty words. Then he attacked possible alliances. Behold, you are trusting in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. And Egypt, in fact, was a declining power that promised help and never delivered. But the final blow, the boldest, was theological. The Rabshakeh looked at the walls of Jerusalem and said, "But if you say to me, 'We trust in the Lord our God,' is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, 'You shall worship before this altar'?" The Assyrian general was using Hezekiah's religious reform against him. He was telling the people, "Your king destroyed the altars where you worshipped. He offended your God. Why would that God save you now?" It was a brilliant distortion of the truth. Hezekiah had removed pagan altars and corrupted centers of worship. But for the common people on the walls, terrified, hearing an enemy general shout in their own language, the logic could seem convincing. And the Rabshakeh did not stop there. He listed one by one the gods of every nation that Assyria had destroyed: Hamath, Arpad, Sepharvaim, Samaria. Every name was a reminder of a people who trusted in their gods and was wiped off the map. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? How then should the Lord deliver Jerusalem? Silence. The text says the people remained silent. No one answered a word, because Hezekiah had given an order, "Do not answer him." The king understood that this was not a debate to be won, with arguments shouted from the top of a wall. It was a spiritual battle that required a different response. And Hezekiah's response is one of the most powerful scenes in all of the Hebrew Bible. When the officials returned and repeated every word of the Rabshakeh, Hezekiah tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went straight to the temple he had reopened, to the same temple where Isaiah had seen the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up. And from there, he sent messengers to Isaiah, not to ask for political advice, not to discuss military strategy. The message was simple and devastating in its honesty. This day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. This metaphor: a woman at the most extreme moment of labor, her body trying to expel the life it carries, and without the strength to complete the act. The child stuck, the mother exhausted, and no one can help. Hezekiah was saying, "We are at the limit. We did everything we could. The walls are reinforced. The water is guaranteed. The soldiers are positioned, but it is not enough. Nothing we can do is enough." And Isaiah's response came quickly and without hesitation. "Thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the young men of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." Isaiah, the same man who had been ignored by Ahaz, now delivered to a king who listened the same central message he had always preached. Do not fear. Trust. But Sennacherib did not give up so easily. He sent a second message to Hezekiah, this time a written letter, and the content was even more direct. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. And shall you be delivered? And what Hezekiah did with that letter defines who he was as a king. He took it. He went up to the temple. He spread the scroll before the altar, and he prayed. He did not whisper. He did not send a priest to pray in his place. He himself, the king, opened that death threat before God and said, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. And then the sentence that transformed this prayer of despair into a declaration of faith. So now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. The answer came through Isaiah, and it was long, and it was poetic, and it was devastating. Isaiah chapter 37, starting at verse 22. God, speaking through the prophet, addressed Sennacherib directly. The virgin daughter of Zion despises you, she scorns you. The daughter of Jerusalem tosses her head behind you. The image is of a young woman looking at a defeated aggressor, walking away and shaking her head with disdain. And then came the sentence, because you have raged against me, and your complacency has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came. A hook in the nose. In the Assyrian reliefs, on Sennacherib's own monuments, there are scenes of prisoners being led with literal hooks pierced through their lips and nostrils. The same humiliation that Assyria inflicted on others would be the image of its own defeat. And then came the night. That night. The text of Isaiah 37 verse 36 tells what happened in a single sentence that has echoed for nearly 3 millennia. And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies, 185,000, from one day to the next, without a battle, without a siege, without negotiation. The greatest army of the ancient world simply stopped. Historians have debated for centuries what happened that night. Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote 250 years later, recorded an Egyptian tradition saying that mice invaded the Assyrian camp and gnawed the bowstrings and the shield straps. Many modern scholars suggest a plague, perhaps bubonic plague, perhaps dysentery, perhaps cholera, spread by the unsanitary conditions of a massive military camp in the heat of the Levant. Others point to logistical problems or a revolt in the rear of the empire that forced Sennacherib to retreat. What we know for sure is this: Sennacherib never conquered Jerusalem. This is an archaeological fact, not a matter of faith. The Taylor Prism itself, the document where Sennacherib boasts of his conquests, is revealing in what it does not say. Regarding the 46 cities, he lists destruction and deportation. Regarding Jerusalem, all he can say is, as for Hezekiah the Jew, I shut him up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. A bird in a cage, not a dead bird, not a captured bird, a bird he surrounded but could not catch. In the entire history of the Assyrian annals, decades of campaigns against dozens of cities and nations, Jerusalem is the only case where Sennacherib describes a siege without describing a conquest. And when you contrast the detailed arrogance with which he describes the fall of Lachish, yards of carved reliefs, every phase of destruction celebrated in stone, with this single evasive sentence about Jerusalem, silence screams. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, and just as Isaiah prophesied, he died by the sword. 2 Kings chapter 19 records that, while he was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, 2 of his own sons assassinated him. The greatest conqueror of his generation, the man who declared himself king of the universe, killed by his own heirs in a pagan temple. And Jerusalem survived. The city that should have fallen like all the others, like Damascus, like Samaria, like Lachish, like the 46 fortified cities of Judah, remained standing. And the man who was at the center of all this, the thread connecting the temple vision to the challenge of Ahaz, to the survival under Hezekiah, was a prophet who had walked the streets of Jerusalem for over 40 years. Isaiah had seen the worst and the best of his nation. He had advised kings who ignored him and kings who listened. He had announced destruction that was fulfilled and deliverance that seemed impossible. But Isaiah's story does not end with the victory over Sennacherib. Because shortly after this miraculous deliverance, something happened that revealed a different weakness. Not military, not political, but human. Hezekiah became ill, seriously ill. Isaiah went to him and delivered a message that had no comfort. Set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover. Direct, no detours, no maybe, or if God wills, you shall die. And Hezekiah, the king who had faced Sennacherib with prayer, who had reformed the temple, who had dug a tunnel through living rock, turned his face to the wall and wept. And he prayed. And God sent Isaiah back before the prophet had even left the middle court of the palace. The new message, 15 more years of life, and a sign, the shadow on the sundial of Ahaz would recede 10 steps. Time would move backward. For a man who had seen time march forward in destruction after destruction, the idea that the hands could reverse must have carried a weight that went far beyond the healing of a disease. But it was what happened after the healing that exposed the flaw. Envoys arrived in Jerusalem from far away, from Babylon. Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a gift officially to congratulate Hezekiah on his recovery. But diplomatic gifts in the ancient world were never just gifts. They were probes, tests, invitations to alliances against common enemies, in this case, Assyria. And Hezekiah, still euphoric from his healing, still savoring the victory against Sennacherib, committed the error that would define the future of his nation. He opened everything. He showed the Babylonians every treasure: the silver house, the gold, the spices, the precious oils, the entire armory, every vault, every storehouse, every strategic reserve Jerusalem possessed. There was nothing he did not show them. And when the envoys left, Isaiah appeared. What did these men say? Where did they come from? What have they seen in your house? Hezekiah answered with an almost naive honesty. They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them. And then Isaiah delivered a prophecy that was not for that moment, it was for the future. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house, and that which your fathers have stored up till this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, and some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Babylon, not Assyria, which was the dominant empire. Babylon, which at that time was only a regional power, trying to free itself from the Assyrian yoke. Isaiah looked 115 years into the future and named exactly who would destroy Jerusalem. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar would do precisely what Isaiah described: every treasure, every sacred object, every son of the royal lineage, carried away to Babylon. And Hezekiah's response to this prophecy is disturbing. The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. And he added, "For there will be peace and security in my days." The same king who prayed with such faith before the Assyrian threat now consoled himself with the fact that the destruction would come after his death. Human nature exposed in its rawest contradiction, extraordinary courage in one moment, banal selfishness in the next. And Isaiah witnessed it all, the faith and the weakness, the greatness and the pettiness. Over 40 years walking through Jerusalem, and the prophet knew that the city he loved, the city God had just saved, would eventually fall, not because of foreign armies, because of its own choices. Jewish tradition preserved in the Talmud says that Isaiah died under Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, the king who undid every reform his father had built. Manasseh filled Jerusalem with pagan altars, placed idols inside the temple, and according to tradition, ordered Isaiah to be sawn in two inside a hollow tree trunk where the prophet had hidden. The author of Hebrews in the New Testament may be referencing exactly this when he writes of men of faith who were sawn in two. Whether the tradition is historically accurate, no one can prove. But what it captures is a truth that transcends archaeological verification. Prophets are not rewarded by their own time. They are understood by the time that comes after, and perhaps that is what makes Isaiah relevant 3,000 years later. Not the specific prophecies, not the historical details, but something simpler and harder to accept. Isaiah lived in a city where injustice was systemic and power was deaf, where leaders made decisions for convenience and called it wisdom, where the difference between survival and destruction depended not on the size of the army, but on the quality of the choices made under pressure. He had no army, he had no political office, he had no wealth, he had words. And with those words he confronted kings, challenged empires, and described a future that was fulfilled with surgical precision. One man, one voice, walking barefoot through streets of a city that refused to listen, and that when it finally did listen, survived the impossible. If you have made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen now. I have selected it especially for you.